Well, good afternoon and welcome to this online conversation. We are so glad that you have joined us today. This is the first conversation in a summer webinar series that we are calling Everyday Faith, Possibilities, Limits, and Callings. My name is Noel Snyder, and I'm a program manager at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And I'm pleased to have as my conversation partner today, my colleague Danjuma Gibson. Dr. Gibson is an associate professor of pastoral care at Calvin Theological Seminary. And he's also in private practice as a psychotherapist in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Prior to joining Calvin Seminary, he was the senior pastor of a church in Chicago for over 16 years and was also bivocational as a commercial banker during that time. Dr. Gibson has many scholarly interests. Among them is a unique approach to looking at the lives of historical people, especially the lives of prominent figures in African American history. Dr. Gibson's most recent book, which is entitled Frederick Douglass, A Psychobiography, Rethinking Subjectivity in the Western Experiment of Democracy, is an investigation into the formation of Douglass's psychological and religious identity in the context of trauma and the American slavocracy. And now more recently, Dr. Gibson has been researching the lives of other, what he's calling titans of African American history, and we'll hear a little bit more about that term and how you're using it. I'm looking forward to talking more about that with you, Danjuma. Thank you for being with us here this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're starting, why don't we just start right there, what I mentioned. You're working on a writing project right now. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that. What's it about? Where does it come from?
Thank you, Noel. This current project comes out of the interests from my first project with Frederick Douglass, and it was a psychobiography. And anytime you are talking about biography versus psychobiography, what we are doing here, what I'm attempting to do, is to get inside the person's inner world. What is it that makes them tick? So for instance, with Frederick Douglass, it was an investigation into his material or his interior world. I was after a theory of mind. So given all of the data that we have with Frederick Douglass, his autobiographies, his many speeches, his editorials, similar to how I sit with a client in a therapy room, I studied that to understand if we can connect to the interior world of Frederick Douglass, then hopefully we can see how we are not that dissimilar from him, that we can make the connections. And so the work that that he did in his time. Similarly, a psychosocial analysis of the environment that he was in. If we can get inside the interior world of the slavocracy, and then how much of that still exists today when we talk about biases, when we talk about hatred, when we talk about systems of oppression. So that's the whole idea behind psychobiography. Now I am trying to do it in this second project with individuals like Ida B. Wells, Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, Fanny Lou Hamer, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King. Now, my challenge here is that there is not as much self-reflective data from these individuals as there is with Frederick Douglass, possibly with the exception of Martin Luther King. And so I'm dealing with limited data, but the goal is still the same. How can we get inside of the interior world of these individuals And then what is the impact when we think of leadership, pastoral care, pastoral theology, Christian leadership, when we think about praxis and what is our responsibility today? So that's the goal here.
Yeah, so you mentioned that with these newer or more recent figures, more recent than Frederick Douglass, that you're working with a little bit less limited data.
Mhm.
But even with Douglass, I was just wondering if you could help us understand. So it's like you're sitting in session, like with having a live person with you, like you do in your practice as a psychotherapist, and
Mhm.
you're sort of evaluating and hearing this person's story, hearing this person reflect in a similar way. What's it like, though, not being face to face with that person and doing it rather from the historical record?
That's a great question. As I analyzed the work of Douglass, now most people will say he has 3 autobiographies. I like to say 4 because there was an addendum he added to his last autobiography. And so the first question you're asking is, why does a person have to write 4 autobiographies? Why can't you write one? But in many respects, I think Douglass is doing what you and I are doing even at this very moment, what our viewers are doing. We are always reconstructing how we understand our lives. Sometimes it may be grief work, sometimes it may be trauma work, sometimes it's just identity formation. And that is very healthy. We are constantly um, doing narrative reconstruction, whether we realize it or not. How do I understand my childhood? Then something may happen in the present. Then you'll look back, I may define it in a different way. How do I define or talk about my college years? How do I talk about my family life? All of that is important. So, for example, I recall as I was studying the work of Douglass and coding it, um, really having to come up with my own set, in many respects, my own set of interpretive criteria through a psychodynamic lens. The more you study it, the more his identity or the theory of mind, the more it begins to take place. Um, it gets scary. And I felt as I was analyzing Douglass, um, in many respects, for example, in my mind's eye, he was saying the same way I would not allow the slavocracy to pigeonhole me, I will not allow you to pigeonhole me as well. I will not allow you to come up with one distinct, specific identity that can fully capture the breadth of the life that I've lived, where one autobiography is written before the Civil War, the next is written after the Civil War, the next is written at the peak of Reconstruction and begins to see its downfall. And the last, or that addendum, I think he's asking questions that if all of us are lucky to live long enough, we ask, what was it all for? And it's very anticlimactic. So the way we like to think of progress in this country, for him, and I think a lot of people will have to face this, it's very anticlimactic. He sees Reconstruction fall, and then he has to ask himself, at least as I'm seeing it, what was this all for? How do I make sense of the life that I have lived? There's evidence that he even sought to figure out how old he was. All of this comes into play because didn't have a birth certificate. And so trying to figure out, how do I capture my life? In Erik Erikson's final life cycle stage, he calls that integrity. How do I narrate or engage in narrative reconstruction of my life where it can have integrity to hold the disappointments, to hold the highs, but hold also the lows that I don't have explanatory power in this moment. This is the same thing I'm trying to do with the other, what I call titans, to help us redefine and understand, how do we understand leadership? Now, the thing is, many people, when I call out those names, they will think of it in terms of this is written for Black people or Black and brown people, and this is about racism. My point is, no, we all have a responsibility. And that's one of the challenges. We'll get to that, I guess, later on when we talk about idealization. I want you to see these people as individuals and as human beings first. And the same way they risked everything for neighbor because they believed the world could be better and should be better, that America can be better and should be better. They risked it all. Once we get into their interior world, we begin to, the excuses fall away. We have to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so good. And there's so much we could say about that. We'll save, like you said, we'll save a little part of that until the latter part of the discussion. Just a note for those who are live on this webinar with us right now, Dr. Gibson is very happy and eager to have you contributing your own questions. There's the Q&A box down at the bottom. If you want to use that to ask a question, he would be happy not even to save those towards the end, but to make it more interactive along the way. So feel free to type those in while we are, well, I've got my own questions for Danjuma as well. So you talked a little bit about this idea of, a healthy life involves, for all of us, for these historical figures that you're looking for, and for us today in the present, a healthy life involves a process of narration, of re-narration, of trying to make sense of the events in your life, how you understand them. And I would maybe, I don't know if I'm adding too much here, but at least trying to find some sort of healing and redemptive perspectives on the narration, the way you narrate your own life. So, and especially with these more recent ones, again, not having that depth or breadth or whatever it is, the volume of self-reflection for a lot of them. What are some of the lenses that you're using when you're looking at their lives to try to get at some of that, how they understood their own subjectivity and how they operated?
Well, I would say the primary lens that I am using is one that is multiple lenses. One is certainly a psychological lens or a psychodynamic lens. One is a spiritual lens. One is a theological lens or a psychology of religion lens. So, for example, how does this, the question is not, is this person a person of faith, or is this person a Christian? I am more interested in understanding, how do they talk about their faith? How do they talk about the divine? This is one of the reasons I believe religious platitudes are so dangerous, because we simply memorize and regurgitate various platitudes that were passed down through generations, but we don't understand what was the reason for the origination of that platitude. And so when I look at these various lenses, sometimes I am looking for just very practical, when we look at the full span of human emotion, where do I hear or see fear coming in? Where do I see terror come in? How are they talking about joy? So, for example, Fanny Lou Hamer doesn't have, or she did not for herself record something that was autobiographic, but we have a ton of data when it comes to her speeches. And we know that in many of her speeches, she got to the point where she didn't want to use prepared notes, that she just told it like it was, or you hear people say sometimes, tell it like it is. And it was incredible. The invitations she received, People wanted to hear her. They wanted to hear that. And even in analyzing some of those speeches, how does she talk about her youth, if she does? And if there's another speech where she talks about it, are there any changes in how she talks about it? What does she emphasize here? Why didn't she emphasize it here? Did anything happen between those speeches that may give insight into why she emphasized more here than here? Again, those are the questions I am asking in a psychodynamic from a psychodynamic perspective. It's not necessarily what the person says, but how they say it. And then over the course of time, I'm less interested in the end data points. I'm more interested in the change.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Such good questions. It strikes me that that's why some people are scared of going to a psychologist like yourself, because you ask questions that sometimes some of us don't want you prying into. You're seeing things in there, and you're asking questions that in many ways, if we can receive these sorts of questions about ourselves, and if we can learn to pay attention in those ways to the depths, that's what we'll find in every person. We'll get past this idea of a cliche, these platitudes, like you said, and we'll begin to see a depth and a three-dimensionality and a process, and a person who's always in process and not simply a static figure.
Yeah.
So I think that's some of the healing parts of the way that you're asking those questions. But boy, you're really, those kinds of questions really get you past a certain level and then down into the particulars. And some people, would you say, are not always wanting to go there?
You know, that what you are saying is so important. In any psychodynamic encounter, the first thing you have to break through, that will be for any of us, is the resistance. Because in some respects, you have to say denial and repression, it may have served a good purpose. It makes me functional. And I think this is what we are seeing today. The denial of racial hatred. When we see the threat made to a sitting Michigan governor last year, when we see what happened this year in January at the Capitol, the silence is deafening, but the silence is not new. Because once I acknowledge I have a problem, then the cognitive dissonance doesn't work anymore. I am more and more compelled to act. So if I can say, if the work of the ministry, or if the work that God has called us to do is about reconfiguring how we talk about the story, so we don't have to do anything. In some ways, I say it's that type of defensive mechanism that got you in therapy.
Amen. And hopefully that will be healed in therapy as well over time.
We hope.
Yes. I want to cut to a question here from one of our live attendees. This person was just reflecting on the phrase that you said earlier, "I will not allow you to pigeonhole me." And she says, as a white female ordained minister, I've often resisted being pigeonholed by my congregation. One could also call it individuation, yes? How do you address this concept with the seminary students you teach?
Thank you for that. I address it through the concept of self-work and self-care. Many times when we think about, and when clergy thinks about self-care, they are thinking about vacation time. I'm not talking about vacation time. When I think of self-care, I am talking about those times where hopefully at least on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, you can withdraw and engage in the sorts of activities where you are cultivating your true self as opposed to the false self that we have grown up with. So many pastors, for their congregations, they are presenting a false self. And it's a lot of times it's unconscious, because when we talk about the false self that comes, or one of the theorists that talks about that is D.W. Winnicott. We are talking about that presentation of ourselves that we have learned to show other people. And we've learned that based on how we grew up. And sometimes there were ways that we manifested who we are truly in our core, but our caregivers didn't affirm it. Instead, we got looks of disapproval. And I'm not talking about doing wrong or sin. It's just, for instance, a parent may say, you know what, you're loud, don't be so loud. Or don't ask so many questions, or don't cry. We internalize all of those messages of rejection. Sometimes we internalize them from a societal perspective, when we internalize the various stereotypes. So, for instance, this question is about, you said a white female clergy person. We may internalize stereotypes that come from sexism, debilitating stereotypes that comes, xenophobic types misogynistic types of stereotypes. And we internalize those, and over time they create a false self. This is the self I try to present so that I can secure your smile, so that I can get others around me to like me, so I can secure your approval. Likewise, this is what I think we see in part with the Titans, but also with Frederick Douglass. There was a particular part of himself that he could have presented that would have gone along with the stereotypes of this is who Black and brown people are. But he did the kind of self-work to resist that, because it's so easy to internalize it. So in response to that question, the answer is it comes through self-care. It comes through your self-work, where you are doing the work. When we talk about self-work, what are those unresolved issues from my past? What are those unresolved hurts that I put a Band-Aid over because I was told big boys don't cry? What are those things where my caregivers may have told me, are you going to be a victim or are you going to be victorious? So forget about that stuff and keep moving on. As you deal with those things and form narratives around it, Noel, then you are able to avoid being pigeonholed, no matter how those around you may do it, because you're grounded in your own sense of self.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's probably a good transitional place now for us to look at even some of the particulars of the stories of the people that you're researching right now. So we're already planning to do another one of these later on this summer and in July. So we'll get to some of the others at that time. Maybe if we could just start with a few of the particular stories of the people that you're looking at. I think you mentioned to me Ida B. Wells and Fanny Lou Hamer are a couple of stories. So what are some of the particulars of your life, of their lives? What are some of the motivations and traits that you're noticing in their own sense of self? And how do those features play out in these people's lives? What are you seeing?
Sure. Well, I mentioned Fanny Lou Hamer, and one of the, at least what I'm calling in this project, one of the observations or traits that's really jumping out at me is what I refer to as transformative love. When I'm reading her speeches, it is just becoming so evident that she's doing what she is doing, not for attention, but this sort of transformative, revolutionary love um, that's causing her to do something on behalf of those that she is representing. And really, where I got this idea from Fanny Lou Hamer was research, some qualitative research that I did in Chicago with a group of um, Black males. This was about 3 years ago, teenagers in a high school. And I think something happened in that research that no one expected. As these guys were talking about their experiences, these were teenagers, ninth grade all the way to 12th grade, as they were talking about their experiences, um, as they were talking about uh, things that were going on in school, things that were happening at home. They were talking about their own outlook for life. Something unexpected happened. Um, I was filming them, but then I began to notice that the faculty that were in the room, when I turned around, they were all in tears. These boys moved us in a way that no one was prepared to be moved. And they were talking about part of this, a large part of their story, they were talking about their love for each other, for their peers, but also the faculty. Now, as a scholar, I've been asking myself for several years now, especially the last 4 years, what does love look like? I mean, since scripture says God is love, that is the most powerful ontological statement. God is love. So it follows then that if I can figure out what love looks like, that gives me a closer description of what God looks like. And out of that, looking at those boys, the boys were teaching us. I began to look at Fanny Lou Hamer. Um, and there is a passage, there's a little book. So I combine several points. These boys, I found the work of Fanny Lou Hamer, and then there's a small writing that many people overlook by Martin Luther King. It's called The Measure of a Man. And in it, he's using the parable of the Good Samaritan. And when he talks about, everyone's familiar with the story where the priest passed by, the Levite passed by, and then he says, what was it that caused the Samaritan to stop? And so as King is articulating this, he says, and I'm quoting him in this text, he says, so I imagine the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? That sounds like a question a lot of people ask, or we talk about today. He says, then the Good Samaritan came by, and the very nature of his concern reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to me? So then I come up, and if you quote me, please give me credit, audience. I come up with, here's what love is. And the reason it's important to talk about this in this project is too often we just assume that we are love. And we assume that love is this. If I don't hurt you, then I automatically love you. In many ways, we've learned this as we've grown up because we equate love with the absence of abuse, the absence of trauma. But when I think about these boys, Fanny Lou Hamer and King, I am saying love is my willingness to get involved with you. That's what it looks like. Love is my willingness to get involved with you on behalf of you for your sake. It's the courage and vulnerability. I have to get involved with Noel for his sake. And if you would, if the audience, if you would excuse me for a moment and don't sexualize it, love is about me getting into an affair with you for your sake. When you look at these titans, and here's why idealization is so bad. They did not do this for recognition. Or when you look at Fanny Lou Hamer, she decided, for instance, to help the poor in Mississippi secure the right to vote. I have to get involved with them. I cannot simply ignore it, make the claim, as we all do all the time, oh, I just love everybody. But what does it look like? So can we say we love and we're silent? Can we say we love, but I don't get involved?
Mm.
Because we're always asking the question that, at least in King's mind, he said this is what the Levite and the priest were thinking. What's going to happen to me if I get involved? You know full well when we say Black Lives Matters that we are not saying that white life doesn't matter. But if I get involved with you, what's then going to happen with my family?
Mm. Mm.
What will happen with my colleagues? I know my colleague or my friend or my coworker, they have bigoted hatred or rate. They do things that are, they say things that are inappropriate. I know this shouldn't have happened if I'm a person in power, but what happens if I get involved? What will happen to me?
Mm.
And so we shy away and we continue to imagine, we're not asking the question, what does love look like? So we imagine that until I do wrong, like an honorary degree, love is just imputed on me. Hey, I love. Why? Because I say I'm a Christian. That doesn't work.
Mm.
Fanny Lou Hamer, I believe the highest education she got was sixth grade. She got more speaking appointments than a lot of PhDs. She was berated. It's easy to think that she was berated, or to imagine how she was berated by, you know, people who were bigoted, racist. But she was also berated by the so-called many people who were in the civil rights movement, as they taunted her lack of education. They made fun of her dialect. They made fun of her looks. They made fun of her presentation. They made fun of her Southern ways. And through all of that, she said, I am willing to get involved with. So that's my work on, that's what I'm developing
Yeah,
in
I love
Fanny
it.
Lou Hamer's interior world.
Yeah. I think the Good Samaritan story, then it provides such a good
Mm-hmm.
framework for
Mm-hmm.
understanding that. You're seeing in her, there's a turning point. She
Mm-hmm.
she reaches that man who's lying there beaten in the middle of the road or on the side of the road and says, what am I going to do about it? And has to decide for herself.
And what will happen to me if I don't get involved?
Yeah.
This is what we're not asking ourselves in the church. And we are seeing, I think a lot of people are afraid today for things and they're afraid, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
This, what we saw, what we've seen, this racial tension and what we saw in January, that just didn't start on January the day before.
Mm-hmm.
This is decades of not getting involved.
Mm.
These are the symptoms
Mm-hmm.
of not getting involved. When you have the power not to get involved, that's dangerous.
Mm.
And as I said in another talk, we're living, we're on the dangerous edge here. Very dangerous, where the cost of silence will be more than we can pay for if we don't learn to become unsilenced and get involved. So that's the transformative love that Fanny Lou Hamer can teach us.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And I hear you saying that not only are we experiencing now the fruits or the cost of not getting involved for decades, longer probably too, but at least for recent decades, but you're saying now there's still a moment, and we are on the cusp of it right now, where we still need to be asking that, and it's going to be very, very dangerous and costly if we don't get involved.
Well, thank you. That is exactly what I am saying. And I base that on history. So if someone asks me, well, what hope is there? I say we still have time. We still have time. But we see this. This has happened historically in South Carolina in the early 1900s, where a coup to overthrow a local government actually succeeded. This was before, now we're talking about the anniversary of what happened in Oklahoma. But before that, there was success. There was success. I believe it was in Wilmington, if my memory serves me correctly. And so we have history to learn from, that our silence is not, there's a cost.
Mm-hmm. And we still have time in the present moment.
We still have time. Yes. It was in the Wilmington, North Carolina race riot, or race massacre of 1898. And it's not until about 100 years later that North Carolina began to officially discuss and talk about and actually own, this is what happened.
Mm. Mm. So I want to go to another one of the questions from our viewers, our participants in this webinar. So someone's asking, the Titans that you identified were involved in major efforts of systemic resistance, prophetic challenge, and cultural transformation. I'm curious if you've noticed any common practices or habits that they learned or that they leaned into for self-care or for grounding themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for many of them, so a couple of things. For many of the names that I mentioned, whether that's Fanny Lou Hamer, whether that is Martin Luther King, Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, their practices of faith out of their religious tradition was very formative to them. But these were not practices of faith in terms of legalism. These were practices of faith that affirmed the core and the essence of who they were. You can't talk about a Fanny Lou Hamer, without talking about her religious tradition that she was birthed out of, even with all of the world-class theological formation and philosophical formation that we see in a Martin Luther King. You can't separate that from how his religious tradition formed him and held him and cultivated him. But then I would also say, and I talk about this a little bit in my Frederick Douglass book, it was also their work. How do we understand work as self-care? Work and occupation are two different things. When I talk about work, I am thinking about, what is your life project? What is it that you do that after you die, someone could look at work and say, you know what? Noel used to be here. Because what is left behind, this looks like Noel. This reads like Noel. This feels, these artifacts feel like Noel. So your life's work is that which you do, even if you didn't get paid, you have to do it. Your life's work is that which gets you into liminal space. Now, very few people are not lucky enough to have their vocation and life work line up together. So when I think of people like Frederick Douglass, and I ask the question also, why does someone have to write an autobiography? He had a paper as well. Part of it, why did they have to write it 4 times? Douglass wrote so much because in part, it was his work. It was his work. It sustained him. Imagining, his imagination, his intellectualizing. So I invite those who are with us today. The question, people who know me they may have heard me say this before. What is your work? Your work is what you can't stop doing. They have to kill you to stop you from doing it. Unfortunately, that happened with a couple of the Titans.
One of the things that I have loved hearing you talk about this subject, even before this, is drawing that connection between self-work and self-care. And we don't really know how to care for ourselves until we also know how to do that self-work, because our self-care comes out of our self-work. Am I getting that right?
I love it. Couldn't say it better myself.
Yeah.
You can finish the lecture.
One of the other things I was noticing, though, about the way that you answered that question is the idea of having one's religious tradition, and can I even add, the communal tradition, the community with which one participates in one's faith, that itself being essential practice.
That is so true. And so let me add to that. Being in theological education, and I would say I'm a part of it. I mean, I'm a part of theological education, but I'm a part of this problem. We make the mistake of thinking that faith is intellectualizing. That's nothing but modernity. And with a lot of these individuals, faith is less taught and it's more caught. People, in Dr. Gibson's estimation, they generally are not Christ followers or Jesus followers because they read something. They become Jesus followers by being around other Jesus followers. Faith is generally more caught than it is taught. You are assimilated into the practice of, when you are in a community where you are held and people affirm you, then you learn to be affirmed and loved. So that when you go in an environment that wasn't designed for you, an environment that when it was made, it didn't have you in mind, you have internalized, now you're taking into that these internalized objects of affirmation, those voices of the past that said you are beautiful, the voices of the past that said you are worthy, that know you belong there.
I love it, and I hope I'm not taking it in too far afield.
No.
If I just add to that, that's one of the things that I appreciate and also think needs to be pushed further when we at the Worship Institute talk about formative worship. We oftentimes talk about the formative nature of worship, and we're looking at orders of worship and what element follows after one other element. But oftentimes, if we get a little bit too stuck on the one-dimensional nature of what worship is and how it's formative, we're missing so much of what's the environment of the community that's practicing this worship? What is the interpersonal dynamics that are going to be just as formative or more so than the logic of the way that the order of worship unfolds? And so it's not that I think that we shouldn't talk about formative worship. I want to talk more about it, but talk about some of the things that are kind of oftentimes invisible to our eyes.
That is, I love the way you say that. And that fits exactly with what I would say was very formative for a lot of these Titans. For people who are in education or the ivory tower, they can relate to this. You can relate to this. Sometimes if you're in an interview or you're somewhere, someone will say, who informs your theology? And so, you only got a limited list. You got to talk about, whatever, is that Calvin, is that Barth, is that Luther, is that whoever some of the big names are out there, Paul Tillich, or is it Luther? But if I'm answering the question honestly, it's my parents.
Mm-hmm.
It's the relatives I saw preaching.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that I can't tell you, but you learn to adapt the language to survive.
Yeah.
I can't tell you that Abraham Kuyper uh, may inform my praxis. No, it was my parents that said you should always be involved in something meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
It's watching people around you say silence is not an option. It's growing up in an environment where it's ministry is not about acquiescing to the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
It's caught.
Yep. It's caught as much or more than it is taught. Mm-hmm. Amen to that. So I wonder now if we can finally get to this long-awaited topic
Oh
of
my goodness, what is that?
how do we avoid idealizing these titans of African American history? And let's just maybe stick with Fanny Lou Hamer for a moment here.
Yeah.
So there's a danger there, of course, especially because they're not contemporaries of ours. And so as we look at their lives and seek to learn from them, how do we not idealize them?
Mm-hmm. That's so a couple of things. I don't think when we talk about human development, psychological development, there is a train of thought and a thought that I agree with that you will never totally be done with idealization. We idealize, let's just talk first about why we idealize. We idealize in many respects to deal with our own internal anxiety, our own fears. And so we do it to soothe. Now, the thing about idealization, to understand why the danger is, we idealize, we impose these superhuman qualities on people, these super moral qualities. We need to imagine them being that way, but then you also then gravitate close to that person. That could be closeness, if you're lucky enough that maybe that's physical proximity, but generally we're talking about psychological proximity. We idealize because we have a need for heroes, to believe that there is something out there to aspire to that's bigger than me, because I have not developed the internal capacity where I can form ideas for myself or form these great ideas. So I idealize your pastor. You idealize. So, for example, kids, let's say little boys, little girls, they idealize their father. Their father is the strongest person in the world. So they say, I'm like my father. Look at my muscles. Look at this. Look at that. Generally, idealizations, they break because you will see the person you idealize do something or fall short of what you idealize. And so then you're devastated at that point. From a therapeutic perspective, I would say that devastation is redemptive, because now you will begin to form or practice forming these ideas that your hero disrupted. That's what we see a lot of times when we look at history. And I believe now when we look at these figures. And so here's 3 ways idealization is dangerous. First of all, it caters to our need for heroes. Secondly, it makes us believe that these titans wanted to do what they did. So it's letting me off the hook. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not, I hear this all the time. That's not my calling. And that's why I believe the term activism, I love it. I have no problem with it, but it can be dangerous, because when we call these people activists, it immediately lets all of us off the hook, and we say, well, that's not my calling. So it makes us think that these people somehow wanted to do it, and it lets us off the hook. Or when we idealize or romanticize, we make it think that sometimes, as if those times in those times, it was more conducive for them to do that kind of work. But we're living in the different times. It wasn't the times that made the Titans. The Titans made the times.
Amen.
And so how do we break this? Similar way that I try to do in a therapy room. It's what I'm doing in this book. If we can see, no, they didn't want to do this. If we can see, no, they had fears. Many of them were terrified. If we can see, and I believe, and I'll start this a little bit in this next book, if we can develop a traumatological lens of the civil rights era, how do we interpret it from a trauma perspective?
Mm-hmm.
If we can see the doubts they had, if we can demythologize them and make them human, now I can connect with that humanity and begin to do the work that they did that we desperately need today.
So one of the questioners is actually wondering also if you could say more about this concept of our need for heroes. And she's wondering if you would connect that to idolatry, the same thing that we've been doing, looking to things other than God ever since Eden.
Well, I don't know that we can necessarily do that. When we talk about idolize or idolatry, we are really talking about believing in something else, or that something else works better than the divine, believing in it, in its promises beyond the divine. And so idolatry can be a lot of things, but we're basically saying that's going to be my go-to versus the divine. Idealization, which is really a totally different word, is more about how do I need to imagine you in a way that soothes my anxiety. For example, that and whoever that is, I can idealize you. How do I need to idealize you in a way that soothes my anxiety that people who are like you are not doing X, Y, or Z? If that makes sense. How do I idealize my pastor in a way that soothes my anxiety that Christian leaders may be just as vulnerable and afraid as I am? So it's more about a need. People do this in history all the time. They idealize figures. Abraham Lincoln, probably one of the most idealized presidents. But you don't want to read how he thought necessarily about those who were enslaved. We just want the Emancipation Proclamation version.
Yeah. Yep. That's helpful. That's a helpful distinction. Thank you for addressing that. So we have a few minutes left in what we've planned on here. And so I wonder if you could just share with us if there's any ways that you're seeing connections to worship. This is the Worship Institute, and those could be ways that each of the Titans that you're looking at are participating in worship themselves, as we've already talked about and alluded to a little bit, but also what are some of the lessons that you're learning and how do those things play out in corporate worship especially?
The Titans are pointing us towards, similar in a therapeutic encounter, they are pointing us towards the fact that we have to wrestle with truth. The truth about who we are. The scripture says in the 4th chapter of John, God is looking for true worshipers. The question I'm asking is, what is the nature of worship if the life is false? I've asked myself from a research perspective, how do we talk about worship on the plantation? Can you worship on a plantation? if we don't come to terms, so if God is looking for true worshipers, how do we account for false worshipers? I think Douglass already talks about this. Here's a picture of it in the appendix of his first autobiography, which he's probably most known for. It's the shortest one. But this is where he's making these classic comparisons. He's saying it's the church that's the biggest purchaser of enslaved men and women. He says we have men sold to build churches, women sold to support the gospel, and babes sold to purchase Bibles. He's challenging the core. At the beginning of the appendix, he says, what I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. In some ways, that's very Calvinistic. Visible church versus an invisible. He's making this distinction here. There's a cost to pay when the church, or when our understanding of faith and Christianity becomes intertwined with nationalism, when it becomes intertwined in Westernism. It's not a good mix. And history has shown us this. You know, Douglass goes on to say that because he protests this, he says, I am branded in the church as an infidel. In the final years of King's life, it was people from the church that gave him probably, arguably, that talked about him the most. People resisted him when he talked about the war in Vietnam. So we have to go back and look at this historically from a psychological perspective, look at the interior world from a psychodynamic perspective, and we can look at it and say, hey, the same interior world that we exhibit today that's causing this is not new. This was the interior world of the collective and many individuals at that time. Mm-hmm. Those are the implications for worship. If you don't have truth intertwined with worship, you run the risk of worship condoning what I call in this text anti-love practices.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. That is a good word. That's a hard word, a truthful word. I think one that we desperately need, and we need to be talking more about. And to that end, I will just mention that we are, even though this webinar now we're concluding, but you and I, Danjuma, are scheduled to talk again on July 14. Awesome. of next month, July 14. It's another Wednesday at 1 p.m. So we don't have an announcement out about that yet, but consider this for you, those who are watching live, consider this the first announcement to keep an eye out for that. And really look forward to continuing this conversation, to hearing a little bit more about some of the stories of the people's lives that you're looking at, and really helping us to get down deeper beyond the surface level idealizations, the one-dimensional, all the ways that we exclude ourselves or get ourselves off the hook by not asking the deep questions that you're helping us to ask. So I thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and we'll do this again in a month.
Look forward to it.
Bye.
Bye.